Hey, it's Warren Hewitt here. Hope you're doing marvellously well. Today I'm with the great Ian Shepherd. How are you, mate?
I'm very well, thank you.
Now, where are you for a start? I know you're in England, but whereabouts are you?
I'm about 20 minutes outside Cambridge.
Oh, rather lovely.
Very lovely.
Is it a little village or?
It is. It's a little village. My window there looks right out over the cricket pitch. So I get to watch people in white flannels and hear the smack of leather on willow. I haven't actually been out there. I think they eat cucumber sandwiches. I think they really do. I haven't actually been there to check.
With the crust cut off?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, darling.
So it sounds very idyllic and English. It's not a million miles away I grew up. I grew up in a village just outside of... I grew up in a small village outside of a small town. So I didn't have a cricket ground, but I had fields behind me. And we'd walk through the fields and around the fields to get to school. And I didn't really realize until you get older, do you? Sort of the advantages you had, It's like I moved to Los Angeles. I moved to a city. If you can call LA a city, I know you've been here. It's more of a sort of sprawling metropolis, less of like a traditional New York or London, of course, city. But I didn't really understand what an advantage it was or how beautiful and blessed we were to grow up in these kind of places.
No, I was the same. My wife and I both grew up in small, not villages. Well, she grew up in a village. I grew up at the edge of a small town. We lived in Cambridge for 10 years, about 10 years ago. And when we moved here, we were kind of nervous about not having access to, all the stuff that a city gives you. And I think within the first week, it was when I kind of came out of the front door and realized that it was quieter outside the house than it was inside. And I just kind of, ever since then, I've appreciated the peace and the quiet. You walk the kids to school and there's bees buzzing in the hedges. And I mean, you're absolutely right. We can walk from here straight down to the fields, down to the river. There's, the swans stop off there on their migration, whichever direction they go. I mean, it's fantastic. It's good for the soul.
Yeah, that's amazing. It is, and it's good for the focus as well. Having said that, there's all these kind of different environments. I mean, I like being in Los Angeles. I love being in Laurel Canyon where I live because it's surrounded by trees and it's beautiful and you definitely don't feel like you're in a city. But then, of course, if I fly to like New York to work or go back to London or whatever, I also like the frenetic energy. But I don't know if personally I can deal with that 24 hours a day.
No, I'm the same. I mean, you can be in London in an hour from here in the centre of the city, so it's great in terms of having the access, and I enjoy it. I'm exactly the same, but I wouldn't. I just relish, every day, part of my routine, walk the dog, just, get the blood flowing around your brain, get some fresh air, probably get wet in the rain, given that I live in the UK. It's a great, it's fantastic.
So there's a million things that we could talk about, but one of the things that I get asked a lot about is balance. And you're like me, you do everything. You have a full-time career, you're a mastering engineer, but you also have a YouTube channel, you have a successful podcast, you have products that you do. I mean, you do a lot of different things, much the same as me. And just like me, you're married with a mortgage and 2 kids. So what's sort of how's your day? How do you split it up? How do you really kind of make that all work? I know it's a big question, but I think with the sort of new industry and people ask us all the time, how do we do it? And I think I feel very responsible to kind of explain my process to people because I want people to be like us. I want us to be lots of us making music.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I work around the kids, so I really try not to work at weekends. Try and keep that as family time. I get up early to get our older son on the school bus. Once the younger son is at school, then it's usually walk the dog. And then I work pretty much solidly through till about 3 o'clock, grab a bite at lunch. After that, it's a bit more of a lottery because it depends whether, there's family stuff to do. But I try to work then as well. And then most evenings I do at least a couple of hours. I used to do more. These days, I find it harder to drag myself up off the sofa. But and then really it's just a case of what the priorities are. I mean, if there's client work, that basically I block that out. So it's like if I'm going to master an album, that's going to take me at least a day in terms of the hours I have available within a day. Usually like to let it cook overnight and then check it in the morning before I send the approval copy off to the client. If it's mixing I do a little bit of video editing sometimes, various different things, then that's more flexible because I don't tend to have clients around. Most stuff these days is remote. I don't know if that's the same for you. Maybe not if you're in LA.
Yeah.
You have people come to your place?
A bit of both. I mean, when it comes to mix work, I'm actually mixing something for an artist in England at the moment. I mix German bands, French bands, I get a lot of work from around the world. But at the same time, production work is definitely one-on-one. And because my bread and butter is producing, engineering, and definitely songwriting as well. So I like to, and I want to be all those things. I love the experience of having a guy or a girl come in and sit down with them and work on a song, write the song or rewrite it, whatever I have to do, play on it, produce it, engineer, mix it. That to me fulfills all of the things. But to sort of tie that in nicely, one of the things that I don't do, and I hate doing, quite frankly, is mastering, because of all the reasons that you gave in the recent blog. It's difficult for me to separate, and then if I do separate, I'm on to the next thing. So it's like, yes, say I do give myself the day away from it. Well, I'm on another project, or I'm doing this, I'm talking to you, or I'm on a conference call, I'm doing business stuff as well as doing all the other music stuff. So it's really hard for me to find the time to be the mastering engineer of my own stuff. Interestingly enough, I have done mastering for other people, but I always recommend other people before me. So it speaks to that. I think that having a separate mindset for me is a big deal, and I don't know if I personally can do that with my own music. But I do love that you can teach that, because if I'm a home guy and I'm doing one project a week as opposed to 10 projects a week or something like that, and I can separate myself a day or two and then master it, that's where you come in and you teach that stuff, and I think that's a massively valuable skill set.
Yeah, well, it's I think it's like I said in the blog post. I'm a professional mastering engineer. I've been working at it for 20 years. And if people ask me what's the absolute best thing to do, I would always recommend they go to a dedicated mastering engineer, just because of somebody having that impartiality, kind of looking at it from the outside. I think there's value in the fact that mastering is quite a quick process. You kind of, it's not like literally like listening to the album for the first time, because it probably takes 4 to 6 hours to master an album, whereas it might only take an hour to listen to one. But even so, it's much more, rather than weeks or months of the recording and production process, it's very much, what does this sound like the first time I hear it? That's kind of one of the things that a mastering engineer can bring to the project, is just what are the first impressions of this, and does it have the impact that you want it to have? Having a different monitoring environment, just having a different perspective, all of those things are really valuable. But there are people who just don't want to do that. They're like I said, it's a fascinating process, and if you're into recording and mixing, why wouldn't you be into mastering? I think it's different for you I think it's different working as a professional. I think in that case, you need to focus on your strengths. So these days, I have just been doing some mixing for a friend of mine, and I've been loving it. It's just such good fun. But actually, I kind of recognized a long time ago, I don't personally have the patience for the entire production process. For that kind of the week long. I've done kind of recording and mixing of jazz and stuff, but I think that's quite different. The artists tend to come in really prepared. It's probably 2 or 3 days recording, 2 or 3 days mixing, and you're done. That I enjoy. The thought of weeks in a studio, like I say, I don't think I have the patience. I enjoy the challenge of doing a project, boom, it's out the door, onto the next thing. So that kind of suits me, and I think that's why I've prioritized that part of it.
Right, that makes sense.
But yeah, if it's different, if this is kind of a hobby or something you do as well as a day job, something that if you're trying to build a career as a musician or a recording engineer, and then you want. I mean, the other thing is I'm lucky because I got trained. I worked in a studio, and well, I don't know about trained, but I had mentors. I had feedback. There was a process where I could show what I'd done to somebody. In fact, to begin with, everything that I did was assessed. When I started out mastering, if you wanted to have a CD pressed, you needed it to go onto the big U-matic video cassettes. I don't know if you remember those.
I do, yes.
We had 2 U-matic machines at the studio where I worked. There were 5 studios, but only 2 of those machines. I mean, they were hundreds of thousands of pounds. So all the mastering that I did initially went to DAT. And then that DAT tape would go off to another studio and get copied onto the U-matic tape, and it would have the PQ data and all that kind of stuff added to it. So everything I did was checked by a more experienced engineer, and then I got feedback from that. So I think I kind of learned what I needed to know. Whereas if you're up and coming now, the chances of you getting the chance to be trained like that are almost nil.
Right.
And that means you're in a position where you don't know all that fascinating stuff, So I completely understand that people would want to learn about loudness, about balancing EQ, about dynamics, about, all the other stuff that can be involved in mastering. And if they're going to try and do it themselves, I want to help them make a good job of it, because there's nothing more painful than watching somebody doing a bad version of something that you know how to do well, for me anyway.
Right.
So that was the kind of the idea of setting up the website and offering the products. And yeah, I'm really happy to do that. And it's interesting that quite a few people who have bought the product or taken the home mastering course actually then ask me to do their mastering anyway. I think kind of part of that, they learn how it works, they experiment with it themselves, they probably get pretty good results, but then they're kind of actually, I'm going to take the advantage. And they might be, some people who've done the course have ended up working setting up as mastering engineers. And some people who've taken the course were mastering engineers anyway.
Right.
But so what I'm saying is they're perfectly capable of doing a great job and of using the information that I try to pass on, but they would still choose to go to somebody else to have their music mastered.
Right.
So, it's interesting the way, because people, when I first started, I don't know about you, people kind of say, are you crazy? You're giving away all your trade secrets. And I just find it's a positive feedback loop. If you offer the information, people take it and use it, and the benefits come back, and it's a good thing.
I agree.
And that's kind of part of how I make the business work. It's interesting. I was doing an interview this morning for a big research thesis on the loudness wars. But the guy who was interviewing me was saying that was asking how I structured my business and what my attitude was to clients who want their stuff really loud. Because most mastering engineers, if a client comes and asks them for something really loud, they'll do it because they need the work and they don't want to lose the client. Whereas I'm actually in the very luxurious position of being able to say, actually, I don't really enjoy that. I make stuff loud every day, but not stupid loud. And if that's what you want, you probably get a better result from somebody else who really enjoys that process, So
sure.
And I'm able to do that because, like you say, I've got a balance. There's the website, there's the plugins, there's the info products. So I have some flexibility about how I work. And the whole idea of the website when I set it up was to try and give myself a bit of security, because how hard it is in this business. You have a month that's crazy, and then you have a month where there's nothing to do. And the nice thing is, if I'm not being asked to do client work, I just focus more on, something else, and can use that to generate work for myself. So if there are people watching this who want to try and emulate what we've done, that's my recommendation is, identify what you're good at and focus on that, but try and have several different things that you can do, several different ways of generating income. So that you've always, and that's a lesson that I learned from the company where I worked. It was when I joined, I was hired as a trainee mastering engineer, but they were doing recording and editing of classical music. They had the biggest contract, classical recording contract ever at that point. But then we moved into, I started doing enhanced CDs where you put QuickTime videos onto the end of a CD, back before the internet. And then that was a kind of natural progression into DVD. And then I set up my own company to go into Blu-ray authoring. So, and having all of those different things, the company did a bit of recording, bit of production, all the rest of it. Yeah, when one thing was quiet, something else generated some work. So for me, I think it's a risk to say I'm only going to do this one thing, because if there's some kind of problem with that one thing, you've got nowhere else to go. I
agree. That makes perfect sense, and it also feeds into the idea of getting yourself out there. That's another thing, because the traditional. What's interesting is, I started in the traditional music industry. I'm sure it sounds like you did as well. And the traditional music industry was so top heavy. It was so ridiculously top heavy that the opportunity for anybody to get into the upper echelons was so difficult. And so when I hear people complaining about the death of the traditional music industry, that I have a certain amount of, oh yeah, I understand, I get it, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, there's a part of me that goes, I'm happy. I'm really happy, because now we don't have this sort of like, we don't have the creativity being pushed down as hard as it used to be. And there's a lot more flexibility, but it does require a certain amount of hustle, I suppose is the only way I can really kind of say it. But when people hit me with the 10 questions, how do you become successful? How do you create a career? Because I didn't come up with any kind of traditional studio system or whatever, I just say, this is the best time, because every way that I did to be able to build a career is now the way you have to do it. So it's very easy for me to say, yeah, build a social media presence, get yourself out there, get your work out there. I mean, I've worked with so many artists for free or cheap, just for credits. It's been crazy. And none of us want to work for free, but we want to be associated with great work. And if you want great work out there, what is it Tommy Vicari said to me? Tommy Vicari said to me, I think it was the 3 things: the money, the people, or the credit. So it's either such good money that you don't care, you hate the music. It's working with people you absolutely love and you're going to get so much enjoyment out of it that you deal with the other sector. Or the credit is so good that you do it regardless. He goes, he's got to be one of those 3 things for him: amazing money, amazing people, or a great credit. Obviously, if you get all 3, Bob's your uncle. But the reality is like one of those 3 is going to be good for your soul. And I think that I still work on that basis. I still do things that I absolutely love at a fraction of the cost. And I still do stuff that's absolutely well paid because it's really well paid. And then, of course, I do things primarily for credits. And it's just really understanding. It's a difficult thing to minefield to navigate. And I'm sure you get asked the question by your clients all the time, and by the people you get mentored, how to really ascertain those 3 things. For me, I come up with sort of certain answers. What's your sort of response when you get asked those questions?
I'm honest and say I don't really know.
Right.
Because, I mean, you're absolutely right about all of those things. But even when you get an opportunity to, let's say, an interview in a magazine or for a newspaper, you think, well, that's going to be great for my profile, but you don't know how great. Right. I mean, I was interviewed by the Times newspaper about the Loudness War last year when we realized that YouTube was going to start normalizing the audio. I had a blog post. The tagline was, so Taylor Swift is louder than AC/DC, the Sex Pistols, and Motorhead. Wait, what? And people liked that concept that this bubblegum pop would be louder than all of these classic acts. So it caught people's attention. It was a kind of 2-hour interview, so that was a kind of easy decision because why not? But I have no idea whether that was genuinely valuable. And the same thing applies when, if some big artist comes to you and says, oh, can you do this for me? And it's a really difficult, I think you just have to go with your gut, and I think you have to
Sure.
accept that quite a bit of it won't work. And you said balance to begin with, and that's what it is. It's balance. At the end of the day, there has to be enough money coming in the door that you can pay the mortgage and pay the bills and all the rest of it. Once that is reasonably secure, then you can start experimenting with other things. I mean, at the beginning, it's different because you don't have any of that. You're probably struggling to make ends meet. So then it's just any opportunity that comes along, you've got to go for it. I mean, one of the tough things that people ask me is whether they should do, one of the big expensive audio tech courses, and again, my answer to that is, I mean, yes, if you can afford it, and it's something that interests you, by all means. But if somebody, I mean, I'm not in the position where I hire people to work with me, but if I were, I mean, I've had people send me their CVs and say, and they say, I've done this course and this course and this course, but the bits that I'm really interested in is the extra bits. I want to know what bands you recorded. I want to hear some demos of stuff that you've done. And you can't have demos unless you've done the work, and nobody's going to pay you until you've done something that proves that you can do the work. So that means you've got to do some work for free, just to kind of get you. It's kind of bootstrapping, isn't it? That's the term. You've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Sure. You've got to somehow get the ball rolling. And yeah, I try and avoid giving people clear-cut advice because I don't want them coming back and saying, you're wrong, it didn't work.
Well, no, I understand. And look, there's no experts. I mean, there's lots of self-proclaimed experts, but there are no experts because, this is the field this is entertainment, this is music, this is it's like art, any kind of form of art. It's completely subjective. One person's favorite movie is another person's worst movie ever made. There are people I've met, believe it or not, and I'm sure you've met them, that don't like the Beatles. I mean, it makes no sense to most of us, but that does exist. And that doesn't mean they're wrong. It's just we're in such a subjective business. I will say it's just about. I try to clarify to people because when they ask about the sort of the secrets of like how do you get this and this going, I always say, well, with the credit thing, it has to be a tangible A to B, because people will pitch you and say, I have written a song that I'm giving to an artist who's really huge. Would you work on it for free? That's not the same as working for the artist that's really huge. It's like there's a spec thing that's spec. There's sort of basic questions you have to ask the person that's approaching you. When I make this money, I will do this. It's like when people say, when I do this on this spec project, I'm like, that's when I ask for money up front. It's very, there are clear-cut kind of things, but unfortunately, it's knowing the right questions to ask. And I think that's a big one, for many people.
I've thought of something that might be helpful. It's not my idea. This comes from Derek Sivers, who's the guy who set up CD Baby.
Sure.
He sold the company for some huge amount of money and now spends most of his time just trying to help people. He's got a really good blog, sivers.org. I recommend everybody checks it out. But his concept is the hell yes or no concept, which basically says, all of these opportunities. I mean, even if you're just starting out, there are all these things that look like they might be a good idea and they might not. And the ones that you're looking for are not the ones where you kind of go, well, I could do that, but and then there's this and then there's that. You're kind of weighing it up and you're juggling it. The ones you want to go for are the ones where you go, oh, I have to do that. It's a hell yes. It's like this artist, I can't miss the opportunity to work with that person, or this material is so great, I just have to do that, or the money is so compelling that I'd be a fool not to do it. So go for the hell yes, and leave the rest. That's probably because the trick is trying to figure out where the real opportunities are, and chances are if you have doubts and reservations about certain aspects of certain opportunities, probably they're not the ones that are going to be most valuable for you.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that's very true. I will say, to sort of temper that, I know what he's saying, but you and I both know as you're up and coming, there's not that many hell yeses. So, and to be honest, a lot of the not so good people that I work with are the reason why I'm good at comping vocals and the reason why I'm good at doing stuff like that. So you have to, it's a bit like, finding your wife, you have to kiss a few whatevers before you kiss a princess. It's like, I think there's a sort of, there's a place when you're in a medium growing your business, that works perfectly. But I think from scratch, that you don't have any opportunities. If you just wait for the one opportunity that's a hell yes, you may miss out on a lot of others. So
I think
I get the concept, but I think
when you're starting out, it's different because the hell yes might just be anything.
Exactly.
It's like, well, I could do that for no money, or I could do that for no money, or I could do that for £50, $50, whatever.
Sure.
That's the hell yes. It's not like working with Prince or Drake or whoever your idol is, But it's the stuff that kind of just catches your attention out of all of the thing that you keep going back to, you keep thinking about. So yeah, I think it's, there's, the biggest names in the industry, their hell yeses are probably, oh, well, is it Paul McCartney? In that case, no. Is it Taylor Swift? Well, then no. Whereas for us, it's like, it's a band and they want me to record their stuff. Hell yes. So yeah, it needs to have the right perspective on it. But
sure,
it's tough. They're tough questions, and I don't know. But I certainly still, struggle with them, ponder with them.
Yeah, my thing is I just make it work. I make it work. I do. I mean, obviously, there's things I would never do, and there's things I turn down a lot. But I always make it work because I think that there is, when you get a skill set going, and I think this is an important thing for people to know, is when you get a certain level of skill set, you can do multiple levels of work at the same time. That's the beauty of being able to work with bands all over the world. And when you're working on a one-to-one situation, you can open up, especially if you're completely working in the box. I mean, in the box these days, it's insane. You just open up a session, you tweak it, you send them a mix, you wait a day for them to get back to you because they're in a different time zone, and you're working on a different song. Where before, when it was just the world of a console, you had it up on the console for 3 days, waiting for comments. And that you just can't do that these days unless the budget's so vast, which doesn't exist pretty much for anybody anymore. It doesn't matter who you are. We can talk about the biggest names. They're not getting those budgets anymore. So that even that world doesn't exist for them, where they can just sit around for 3 days waiting for, comments. So I think that it's a sort of it's a continually evolving process, and the more we get into it and the more we work, the more we sort of fine tune it. And I think for me, I'm a big anti-dogma guy. Like, I can't stand the dogma, because for me it's like I see a lot of people are held back because they hear that they're told they've done something wrong, or they shouldn't do this or they shouldn't do that. And it's a thing that frustrates me as a guy that's came up completely self-made and not having any kind of schooling whatsoever, and just kind of really hitting my head against a brick wall. And that's the way that most people are having to do it these days. I want to take away that dogma, because I used to get told that, oh no, you can't this, you can't that, you don't have the right mic, you don't have this, you don't have that, you don't have the right experience, you haven't done this, you don't know that guy, this guy, whatever it might be. And so I'm really, really sort of hyper aware of that. I really want to encourage people, because the best music has never come from the slick Pine rooms with the, X number of 100 channel, this, that, and the other. It hasn't. It's always come from Nirvana, who was signed to Sub Pop Records, the Beatles that was signed to Parlophone. I mean, whatever it might be, all the New York bands of the late 60s and early 70s, the Velvet Underground, all of those bands, all of the really important bands that changed the music industry for us, never, ever came from a couple of executives getting around going, yes, we're going to put together this pop band. And yeah, they had successes with those kind of, artists cashing in on other genres. For every Nirvana, there was 57 bands that were signed that were like grunge-ish, that had kind of careers, but we don't look back on those bands and go, they changed the world like Nirvana did. You know, there was Kurt Cobain that changed the world. There was John Lennon and Paul McCartney, you know, so.
No, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I have exactly the same attitude towards mastering, which is what, you know, I mean, there are people who would, you know, kind of refuse to speak to me because I have a course called the Home Mastering Masterclass. And they would say, well, you can't master at home. You need hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of studio and monitors and equipment and all the rest of it. And I'm I mean, all of those things are nice, don't get me wrong. You know, I'm not knocking any of those tools, but at the end of the day, I mean, I go around some of the colleges here in the UK and do a workshop for people. So I do an hour's talk called Mastering Essentials, and then I do a workshop.
Yep.
And basically they bring in stuff that they've been working on a USB drive, and I do a master on whatever equipment they have, and it. You know, it's Logic or it's Pro Tools or it's something running probably on a laptop. It's not in a room, it's in a lecture theatre, and it'll have speakers about this big. But I can still do, you know, in mastering at its core is EQ, compression, and limiting. For these demos, I don't even use any compression. I just use EQ and limiting. So I show them how to calibrate a VU meter, which is a really, you know, if you get an emulated VU meter these days, it's like the one I like is $10 or something. That's a great little loudness meter to start out with, or you know there are free LUFS loudness meters these days. So you need something to tell you about the loudness, and then you need EQ and you need a limiter to stop clipping. You're not going to get incredibly loud results that way because you'd have to push the limiter too hard. But I don't advocate that kind of stuff anyway. So I just go through this process of like, okay, you set the level, you balance the EQ, the limiter is there to catch the peaks, job done, and you can get an incredible improvement of a collection of tracks. You can make three things that sound like they're on different planets, you know, because they're going to be different students, different genres. I mean, these little demos are kind of the most bizarre compilation album you could ever think of. They probably did them in different studios, or they mixed this one of them mixed it on his laptop at home, and the other one did it in the whatever studios available at the college. And so you take these three things that are just out there and you pull them together so that actually they sit together, and they stand up against each other just from changing the EQ and balancing the loudness, and that's the power. It's like so many people have, you know, there's a ton of videos on YouTube, you know, how to master XYZ, and you look at and they've got kind of racks of plugins stacked on the master bus of whatever they're doing, and they, you know, there's a bit of EQ here and there's a bit of limiting there and there's tape saturation there and there's stereo widening there and there's this and there's that. And, you know, 9/10 of the mastering that I do is literally EQ, compression, limiting. That's it. You know, I do have mastering chains that have 7 or 8 plugins in them, but that's the exception rather than the rule. So a lot of people who do the course kind of just come away kind of saying that it's the simplicity in a way of what I'm kind of teaching them to do less, not more. And it's not about what or how you do it. It's about what you do it and why you do it.
Sure.
It's just understanding the goals and what can be achieved. And even the process that I teach people to work in is, well, I mean, I do that on the podcast. Anybody who's interested in this, head over to themasteringshow.com. The first 6 or 7 episodes are just working through my personal mastering process. And I do it backwards, because if I can listen to a song, adjust the level, and do nothing else to it, I'm happy. That's the ideal, you know. If the mix is that good that all it needs is to have the right level set for the context, for the other songs that are around it, and for what the client wants, that's fantastic. And that song is just as mastered as the one that I ran through 8-10 different plugins and, you know, through the kitchen sink at. So yeah, anybody who, I mean, I'm not saying that mastering, you know, like we said, mastering, especially mastering your own music or mastering in the same space that you record and mix in, is not easy. It's really, really hard, but it is possible.
Sure.
You know, and it's not complicated. And then if you're interested enough and have the time to put the energy into learning that process, you can get good at it and you can get fantastic results. And anybody who tells you that you can't, or that you need this magic box or these speakers or this, that, and the other. Honestly, I wouldn't trust what they're saying. I mean, I'm even suspicious of. For me, it's all about the person doing the work, not one of the kind of the unofficial tagline of the course is it ain't what you use, it's the way that you use it. And I genuinely mean that. You can get great results mastering with stock plugins in any modern DAW, because, like you say, well, maybe you didn't say it, but I mean, what's available to us in a $300 laptop and a few $100s of software these days just wipes the floor with the equipment that was used in some of the classic albums of the past. You can argue about the niceties of converters and pre's and all the rest of it, but at the end of the day, it's amazing what's just there for us to use. Which is, I agree with you. Now is the time to get into this stuff because there's almost no limit on what you can achieve.
No, I got asked a great question in an interview a few months ago, and the guy asked me this question. It was just a great question, just stand on its own. He goes, "How do you feel about the fact that now when you open up your laptop, you have $500,000 worth of outboard gear?" It was just a great question, because I used to go into a studio, like my studio, and I've got like before, when it was still on tape, and I've got a PCM, what is that, 70? You think I'm 81. PCM 81. I've got a Lexicon, 42, PCM 42. I've got an SPX 90. TC Electronics 2290 digital delay, and a vocoder, and a couple of a microverb and a quadraverb. And that is not a million miles away from some of the biggest recording studios I went into. 3 or 4 reverbs, 2 or 3 delays, and maybe a couple of funny multi-effects like a vocoder, maybe a flanger, a couple of other weird effects. So possibly 6 or 7 multi-effects would have been standard in even some of the best recording mix rooms I've ever been in. We would go in, because you had a console like this, it's got, 4 effect sends, and then a way of sending a stereo, and I could probably get like 8 sends per channel. So that's the maximum amount of effects I could ever have used on an SSL and a mix. And now I open up my laptop and I can put 40 instances of reverbs and delays and choruses and flangers and whatever. And it's true. Now I have $500,000 worth of gear at my fingertips that I never had even in a $1,500, $2,000 a day studio in Los Angeles.
It is amazing.
So it's amazing.
I've got a copy, I think it's called The Great British Recording Studios, a book for Christmas.
Yeah.
And I struggle to find time to read these days, so I still haven't finished it, but it's a great read. And the thing that, 2 things leapt out at me. One was, we're constantly told about how the ideal proportions of a recording studio and how much acoustic treatment you need and all the rest of it. And you read this catalogue of, literally every major UK artist from the 60s and 70s was recording at one or other of these studios that are in the book. So many of them have control rooms that are square, which is pretty much the worst shape you could have. They have recording rooms that are like 2 squares put together, so a rectangle that is twice as long as it is wide, which is almost as bad as a square. They didn't have proper acoustic treatment, they didn't have proper isolation, and you're absolutely right. They would have had a desk with it was a luxury for them to have 8 or 16 channels to begin with, and Abbey Road and everywhere originally was 4 channels.
Sure.
With mono speakers, and they would have a real Fairchild, which most of us would love and drool over, but they had 1, or I think Abbey Road probably had 4 at one point. They kind of, and that was one of the biggest studios in the business. So, and like all of these recordings that we idolize and that we, kind of drool over and that we want to emulate were made on absolutely minimal setups. The sound comes from the musicians, the playing, how they were mic'd up, the arrangements, and all the rest of it. Some of it comes from the gear, but it's and I get this all the time. I do much less. I've never done a huge amount of major label work, but I do less now that I'm set up on my own, and I'm glad, because there's a lot less pressure, and I get to work directly with the artist rather than talking to people in offices. But the other thing is, you hear all this. I mean, literally, some of the best recordings I've ever mastered have been recorded in people's bedrooms.
Sure.
And some of the worst recordings I've ever mastered have been done in professional recording studios. Some of the biggest names in the business.
Yeah.
I mean, the reverse
I
is true.
remember-
There are still superb recordings that come out of great recording
course.
studios, and they're absolutely dreadful. But I mean, in terms of, regardless of what you think of it musically, but in terms of audiophile credentials, Stephen Wilson, who's in the Porcupine Tree, actually he's achieving mainstream success now. Everybody agrees that his recordings sound amazing. He has a home studio. Now, he cheats slightly because the session musicians that he uses, or the members of his band, a lot of them record their own stuff. So like the guy who's doing drums will have his kit set up in his room with his mics. He knows how it sounds great and all the rest of it. So that helps. But even so, I think a recent album he did go to Abbey Road and record it, and it does sound beautiful. But then so did the other stuff that he was doing as well. And he's still mixing in that home setup that he has. So
Yeah, no, I agree.
it's
Makes
all
perfect
up
sense.
for grabs.
That's a wonderful point, and you're making me think of loads of different things, because now it's about choices. So now we're in this glorious position that if you have a home studio with 2 inputs, or even one, quite frankly, an interface with 1 or 2 inputs, a decent enough budget to afford. I don't know what's Slate's everything bundle now. Didn't he just put it down to $14.99? So you get every single one of his plugins, and I think he's thrown in some third-party ones. And by the way, I know Stephen, he lives down the street from me, he's a friend of mine, but I have no business affiliation with him. I just love the fact that he's making plugins for $14.99 a month that you can do all this stuff with. And everybody I know uses them, along with Waves and Mac DSP I love dearly, So there's all these great plugins that do all these great things. Damn, I could probably just survive on Mac DSP plugins because I know them really well. And they're analog simulations. They sound really good. They really do broad things where I can just boost some top and bottom and just... My point is 90% of my record making process could be done on my laptop. The only reason why I would need to get out of that laptop experience is to record drums. But I have a drum room, but it's small. So maybe I go to a studio to do larger drums. But even then, it's almost like, why would I go to Abbey Road? I love Abbey Road. I'm a huge Beatles fan. Obviously, Dark Side of the Moon, so many great records are done. But I would go to Abbey Road to get the sound of Abbey Road. So I'd go to a room like that, I'd throw mics up, and I would kind of capture the ambience of the room and the performances, just so when I pulled it up on faders on the console, it sounded like that room. The drums would resonate in the room. I go to Sunset Sound over here to get the sound of the room. My point is it would be a very specific project to go and spend a lot of money to be in a room. But the reality is 99% of recordings that are done these days and that we like and we listen to don't need to be done like that. It's almost like that's a specific kind of rootsy, organic, performance-based only recording. Because even as much as, and this could be very contentious, but as much as we love the Beatles or Queen, those bands that recorded incredibly well-produced albums, a lot of it was close-mic'd cabs. They weren't recording the ambience of the room. They were just in an environment where they could be creative. They were in an environment to be creative, like when they did Bohemian Rhapsody in Monmouthshire at Rockfield. Yeah, you can hear the room on the drums. You can hear the bleed between the instruments. But I don't want to go out on a limb and get too offensive here, but it wasn't the sound of the room that created Bohemian Rhapsody. It was the creativity of those guys, of those frickin' genius guys with those incredible layered guitar parts and harmonies and melodies that created that masterpiece, that's still a masterpiece. So you could do that, honestly, in any kind of environment, as far as I'm concerned, if you had those guys. If those guys in 1975 were sitting in my studio, your studio, they would come up with something equally as great because they are those guys. And so I'm a real strong, we're both saying the same thing. It really comes down to creativity. And But I do love going into those bigger rooms, but I tend to go there for the experience of using the ambience of the room, of going into a room where people can maybe spread out a little bit, all the musicians can play live together. But as soon as you move into that overdub world, it's a laptop and a 1 or 2 input for most of people's experience. So when we talk about Steven Wilson, it's not surprising. He has the guy with the drums in his room. He comes in and then it's just him with a DI, him with one mic, acoustic guitar with a pencil condenser, electric guitar with a 57 or a ribbon. You get what I'm saying. It's like...
I do, but now I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Please.
Because we do both agree about that. Mastering is slightly different because just because of the monitoring. There are horrible spaces to record in. Unless you're going for the sound of being in a bathroom, you don't really want to record anything in a bathroom, with all the tiles and the square walls and all the rest of it, and the dripping taps. And actually, somebody told me about a recording studio where the waste pipe for the toilet upstairs went through the ceiling and there was no ice. So every so often you'd have to stop for the toilet flushing. But anyway, that's a completely different tangent. So the room matters in recording. And
yep.
Yes, absolutely. You pay for a great room or you make a space work. In mastering, the challenge is that if there is some kind of fundamental limitation of your listening environment, of your monitoring or of your room, that's going to color everything that you hear and that's going to color the decisions you make. And because one of the goals of mastering is translation, you take it out of the place where it's been mastered and it works on somebody's phone, it works in somebody's car, it works on their hi-fi, all the rest of it. You do have... Now, that's not to say that it needs to be super expensive.
Sure.
But you kind of have different, a set of different criteria. So another one of the things that I help people out with on the course is just how to make that work. And I touched on one of them in the blog post I did for your site about, one thing people can do is just get a really great pair of headphones. I've got Sennheiser HD 450s, I've forgotten the number, 480s, I think. They're expensive. They're as much as some people spend on a pair of studio monitors, but they take the room out of the equation. And then if you add in some corrective software to improve the frequency response of them, you've got a really flat frequency response. Not saying it's possible to master on headphones, although some people make a pretty good fist of it. But for me personally, I still want speakers, but it just gives you that alternative perspective so that you can listen and go, well, is that booming sound that I'm hearing in the room actually in the recording, or is that the sound of the room? So
makes perfect sense. Yeah.
I think we're still saying the same thing, which is you don't have to have hundreds of thousands. You don't have to have an acoustically designed room. This little room that I set up at home, I needed somewhere. Once I left, so I left the company where I worked for 15 years, and then unfortunately 3 months later they went bust. We tried to save. I put in an offer for 2/3 of the gear and stuff, but somebody came in and bought the whole thing out. So the studios got torn down. The gear went the way of the winds, and suddenly because I had been dry hiring the studios there, having left the company, I was still going back in there to work with clients, and suddenly I had no studio to work in. I was lucky that an ex-colleague of mine had set up a room at home with the same monitoring that he had when he worked at mastering studios, so I was able to work there temporarily. But it came to a point where he's half an hour away. Just in terms of my workflow, I had to have something at home where I could listen reliably. So this room used to be the garage, the garage of my house. It's not the perfect shape. It's a little bit on the small side. But I've got some acoustic treatment in here, which, literally when I first kind of came in here after all the work had been done, the paint was still drying and I wanted to put the speakers up, and I kind of and I thought, what have I done? It's not like I spent an enormous amount of money, but it still cost money to have the room sorted out. I thought, this is not going to be usable. Once I got the acoustic treatment in, luckily for my sanity, it arrived a few days later, so I didn't have to wait too long. Then I thought, okay, no, I'm good. This is definitely going to work. And actually, I think I got lucky. The doors used to be there, so that wall it's not even a brick wall. It's half window, and it's half a timber frame with insulation and then timber cladding on the outside. So basically, the bass just goes straight out of the guys playing cricket, which is great for me because it doesn't build up in the room. One of the big myths that people have about when they're setting up studios is the more sound you hold in, the more isolation you have, the more challenges you've got getting it to sound good. Because if the sound doesn't go out, which you don't want it to annoy the neighbours, it's trapped in the room and it's going to do what sound does, which is reflect off the walls and cause all kinds of issues. So I'm lucky. The guys playing cricket don't care if they can hear the bass of what I'm working on booming away in the distance. And beyond that is another playing field. So it doesn't matter. And that bass is not being reflected back into the room. So I got lucky. It sounds better in here than I have any reason to hope for. I think you can make almost any situation work, but for mastering, you have to have the right goals. And I was lucky because I'd worked for so long. I had, I've got my back catalogue, so I can put any one of those CDs on and know how it's meant to sound. So I can, if I changed out my speakers, if I was going to audition some new speakers, I'd be kind of going, well, that doesn't quite, and I'd know instinctively. People who are starting out for the first time don't have that, but what they do have is one of the other points that I made in the blog post, which is you can use reference material. You choose stuff that you love, be it Queen, be it Taylor Swift or Drake or Skrillex or whatever the genre that you're in. If something sounds great to you everywhere, not in your studio, if it sounds great in the car or on your iPod or wherever, that becomes your reference material. That's what you calibrate your work against. So you bring it into the studio, and if you use that as your reference point, then you know that however bizarre it sounds in the room, you're going to be getting closer. Now, if you've got huge problems with the acoustics or limitations in the monitoring, it becomes exponentially harder to get, I don't think I could work in here without the acoustic treatment. It would just be, there'd be too live, there'd be too much build up and all the rest of it. So you have to solve those challenges, otherwise you're going to go mad. But the using reference tracks gives you that option. The one thing I didn't put in that blog post that I think I maybe with hindsight should have added is, for me, I said you don't necessarily when you're mastering want to make your stuff sound great in your studio, because let's say your studio has nowhere near enough bass at 70 hertz. That's a really common, small room, square, null at the listening position. So what you do is you pile in with the 70 hertz, and then when you take it out into the world and play it and everything else, you hear too much 70 hertz. So the challenge to deal with that is to bring in the reference track, listen to it and go, well, I'm not hearing any 70 hertz. So all that 70 hertz I must have been putting in was wrong, and I'm back off and balance it up. And then it'll work when you go out into the world. The problem with that is it's not going to have enough 70 hertz. And for me, that's a really important frequency. Actually 70, let's say 100. 100 is a nicer, 100 is where a load of the warmth is in bass guitar sounds and the low end of guitars and, even some people's voices, all that kind of stuff. You don't have enough 100 hertz. It's going to sound thin. It's going to sound unsatisfying. So when you listen to your reference tracks in your studio, if you hear those kind of problems and you know that they sound great everywhere else, that's the clue that you've got to deal with something in your room, because again, it's just going to be a struggle. If you're trying to make your music sound bad because that's the way that your listening environment makes it sound, that's just hard. It's just not enjoyable. It will still work.
But I agree.
So, and that's where you want to experiment with moving the speakers around, checking your listening position, experiment with some acoustic treatment, all that kind of stuff. But all of these things can be overcome, and it's not like you have to throw an enormous amount of money at it. It's just like learning the craft and everything else. It's just about attention to detail, dedication, and persistence.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's good sound advice. That's kind of a double entendre, isn't it? A good sound advice. I think that I find we had Genelec come down and they measured the room, and the top end was really even, the bottom end was really good. And this is like a haphazardly acoustically treated. It's hard to tell because it looks like it's concrete, but the walls were done by, this is done by a previous owner. And they're all carpeted, which is interesting, not the first choice, but he built these bass traps in on the edges here, and you can't really tell they are bass traps, but they are. And it works relatively effectively. Plus, you know, there's a lot of things to break up the sound. The one thing we had in this was like this little 350 build-up. And that's interesting because when I asked the guys, oh, you know, there's a sort of 350, 3 to 400 kind of low mid build-up, they said to me, that is like 99% of every studio they go into. Low mids are always the ones that are just a little bit out of control. It's like so unbelievably common. And I do cut a lot of 350. Having said that, when I go back and listen on other environments, I always like what I've got. So I think there's probably that sort of sweet spot, isn't there, where you get like, if something is ridiculous, like 3 dB too loud in the room, 6 dB too loud in the room, whatever craziness, it's great. But if it's something that's, you know, that half a dB, that dB up at certain things, you may find yourself kind of like getting into a sweet spot. But now, of course, I'm in this sort of place where I enjoy listening to music here. So like if we have barbecues and stuff, I don't know if you're able to do the same thing. I open the studio doors and we just play music out into the, I don't know if that's possible where you are. But I enjoy having music playing on these speakers, and I enjoy the sound of this room. So I think the big point I get from you is like you have to be able to enjoy listening to music that you're working on in your environment. That's a big one. That's almost like a headline point. It's like if you're working somewhere, it's too harsh, it's too bright, whatever, it's too boomy, whatever, or not of this or not enough of that, and you're battling to enjoy it just to make great sounding music. That doesn't sound like a place I want to work in, especially like the sort of 3 to 5K area where we're really super, you know, sensitive. You know, that kind of area there, which is that kind of harshness. You know, that's not a particularly fun thing to do. You know.
No, I agree, and you reminded me of another suggestion I can make to people watching, which is
yeah.
I mean, I absolutely agree. You need to enjoy how it sounds, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It's not perfect in here. People ask me, do I use the room correction software where you put up a microphone and you measure the response and it applies an EQ curve? And I always say, not until I've exhausted what's possible with acoustic treatment, because just like recording, it's better to get it right at the source, you know, rather than trying to patch it up afterwards. But also, it's not completely flat in here, but it's close enough.
Sure.
And what I've done is I just listen to music in here all the time. And this is my suggestion, that the temptation when you have a studio, when you set yourself up a studio, whether it's you build your dream studio, whether it's the spare bedroom in a house, you want to work on your music. So you sit there and you work on your music in your studio, and then you go out and you listen to music elsewhere, and then eventually you take your music from the studio out into the world and it sounds nothing like anything else you've got. And that's because you have no idea what music sounds like in your studio. So it's kind of easier for me because maybe 50% of what I do doesn't involve actually working on music. So if I'm writing a blog post or planning a new product or updating the website or emailing about what we're going to be doing on developing the plugins or whatever it is, answering questions to people who are doing the course, I have music on. You know, I'm listening to I have Apple Music's suggested stuff for me, or Spotify's on, or it's one of the things in my collection, whatever. And I'm not listening really carefully, you know, it's just on in the background. But over the time, you just subconsciously, so I'm guessing you've probably compensated for that 350 hertz lump that's in your room. You know, you're probably used to hearing that in the music. So the amount of cut you do is probably just right, because your ears are kind of calibrated. It's like another way, rather than having a specific reference track that you say, okay, I'm going to make it sound like this. It's just if you listen to enough music over time, you know, when you're clearing up, when you're tidying out, soldering cables, defragging the hard drive, whatever it is, have some music on. And over time, your ears just learn how it's meant to sound in the space. And providing you like the way that it sounds, then you're going to be in a good place to to start getting great results at whatever you're doing, whether it's recording, mixing, or mastering.
There was and the thing about the 350 is it's a really ugly frequency. It's one of the ugliest frequencies out there. You know, it's not
the worst. There are worse frequencies.
Yeah, 650 is pretty ugly as well, especially in vocals. That kind of
1K is one of my. The thing with all of these is you need enough of them, right? One of the other products I do is the home mastering EQ videos, and that's kind of a point that I go through as part of it. I go through each of the frequency bands and kind of say, this is what this. You have too much of this, it's going to sound like this. You have too little of it, it's going to sound like this. What you need is the balance. It's that word again, balance. You need the perfect amount of it. But
hey, so quick question: how many, if any, of your mastering sessions these days are attended? Do people even want to come by? Is most of your stuff unattended?
Vast majority is unattended these days. And to be honest, I don't encourage it because this place isn't suitable for attended sessions. So, I can use the studio that my ex-colleague has. That's a really nice environment, but he's really busy. So there's limited spaces where I can book it. I master or I use Wavelab, so everything gets recorded back in, and that's Mac and PC compatible, so I can move between his studio and mine. So that's really good. It's possible to be portable, but even so, it's so much more flexible, and it lets me, like I described to you, it means that I can master something, then I can check it in the morning, and then send it off. But also, most people don't want to. So I'm very happy to do an attended session if somebody, really wants to sit down and talk things through with me. But it's, and so much of it is international these days, whereas when I worked at SRT, the vast majority of it was attended, which, I enjoy it. It's great having that kind of one-to-one interaction. But, in an attended session, you would come in, you work on the first song for half an hour to an hour probably, because that first song, you're figuring out what's the sound of this album going to be, and then everything else follows on a little bit more quickly. But you get to a certain point, you kind of turn around and you say, so what do you think? And they say, that's really good, but what about this? And then you there's a bit of to and fro, and then you finish that song and you move on. These days, I don't do demos. I don't have time to do demos these days, but anybody who wants to book me, if they say, I want you to master this album, I always master one song for them. If it's remote, I always master one song for them first. So I do that initial kind of process of figuring out where it's going to be, send it off, and then they send me comments. Maybe I do some adjustments. And then when we're both happy, then I move on and do the rest of the album. Every once in a while, we don't agree about what the sound should be. And at that point you say, well, okay, that's fine. Find somebody else to work with. And I haven't then invested that time in doing the whole project. So there's no bad feeling. It's, okay, so I did one song, but that's not the end of the world. Luckily that's really rare. Most of the time, people are really happy. But so it's kind of like an attended session. It's just spread out over the course of maybe a couple of days instead of a couple of hours. So it's exactly the same kind of feedback process. And in some ways I would say that it's better. Because one of the disadvantages of attended sessions is that the clients have no idea how things sound in whatever room you're working in.
In your room, yeah.
And in particular, at SRT, that could be an issue because, it had the big B&W 801 speakers. Mm-hmm. So most people were just so astonished by the bass.
The low end.
The low end. They were kind of like, well, it sounds good, but I'm going to have to trust you because I have no idea what this should sound like. They hadn't been through that process. That was
exactly that was my first experience when I attended a mastering session. I don't know if it was the B&Ws or what it was, but I remember being in this room. It was Eddie Schreier. Do you remember Eddie Schreier? In the 90s, he did pretty much so much West Coast stuff. So I'd done an album out here in 95, 96, and we went to master it. And I was in Eddie's room, and I'm like, I don't know how this sounds. I mean, it sounds good, but there's all this like low end that I've never heard before. And I was just like, if you think it's okay to have this massive low end rumble, he's like, oh, no, that's tight. But, because it had that 20 to 40 kind of going on that I'd never heard through, regular speakers before, it was really unsettling. But then I've worked with mastering guys that have speakers this big.
The speakers I have here are not huge. I mean, it's all about, I think with all of this stuff, you need a certain minimum standard. If you try and master on, I don't know, a mobile phone, you're doomed. But providing they are reasonably linear, providing they're reasonably accurate, all of those.
What speakers do you have?
Kind of things. Mine are B&Ws. They're just the little. Which ones are these? Well, I mean, they're 602s. They don't make them anymore. I mean, that's the other thing.
Right.
Is you can't, with speakers, you can't rely on the. Like I've tried the model immediately after these, the Series 3 version of these speakers. They're still good, but they're not quite right. That whole thing of enjoying how things sound. The next revision of these speakers to me sounds a little bit cold, a little bit clinical. The bass is tighter, but it's not as full, and I like to hear a really nice kind of full bass. So you can't even rely on a particular brand or even a particular model of speakers. It's all
sure.
that whole learning process that we were talking about in terms of tweaking the room, tweaking the acoustic treatment, all of that, it applies to speakers just as much. So the good thing about not having an attended session is that the client gets more time. Because the other thing is, if it's an attended session, they've booked 4 to 6 hours with you on this day. They might have travelled from hundreds of miles away potentially to work with you. There's a lot of pressure there on me and on them on me to get it right and on them to make the right decisions, to give me the right feedback in an unfamiliar listening environment. Whereas working remotely, they get it back, they take it out, listen to it in the car, listen to it wherever. The extra time that's involved, I think actually is a good thing because they get to hear it on the systems that they know and understand. And I think, it's always great to have somebody sitting next to you to have that dialogue.
As you were saying right at the beginning, which I really valued, was that thing about where people say it to me and they say to you, why are you giving away all these tips? It's like, well, firstly, none of us hear the same way at all. None of us, you remember that, is it black, or is it a black and white dress? What was it? Or is it a gold?
Blue and gold.
Blue and gold, but it was actually black and blue. It's like that with sound. It's hard to quantify because sound is an opinion. It's not something you can point at and go, that one or that one. But it's so subjective that you can tell me exactly how you master something and I'll bring in the presets and I'll listen to it and go, no, he's wrong. It needs to be like this because I hear it differently. That's why there's no right way or wrong way to do it. And that's the beauty of what we do. And as we were talking about earlier, mistakes are part of everything. Making a mistake is how we learn. Not only do we learn, to make it better, but sometimes we make a mistake that teaches us something better by like, oh, that isn't a mistake. That's actually a new way of doing something. So we're blessed to be able to do this. We really are.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be doing it now, this is crazy, right? You and I mean, it's now 1:20 a.m. here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
What time is it there for you?
Well, we started a few hours ago, so it is now 5:20.
Okay, there you go. But we're having a conversation in real time with video that we're going to record, and we're going to be able to, I don't know how, theoretically it could be online tomorrow for everybody else to watch and benefit from. Organising Dynamic Range Day, I'm having conversations. There's a guy in Germany, there's a guy in America, and we're all and sending each other links and all the rest of it. The album that I'm mixing for my friend, it's a kind of quite a retro kind of thing, and I thought this needs ADT, right? Double tracking, like the Beatles have. Oh, there's a Waves plugin for that. I'll give it a try. Downloaded it, demoed it, loved it, bought it. Half an hour later, I'm using it on most of the tracks on the album. Whereas, back in the day, you know, you'd have had the thing shipped in from America or something. It would have taken months to arrive, and there'd be one, and it wouldn't work because it was the wrong voltage, so they'd have to do a custom mod on the thing to make, you know.
Well, you remember when we were kids and they had like the Paul McCartney was doing, you know, Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, Paul McCartney, Michael Jackson, and there was all this big deal about like Paul McCartney was in a studio in London, and then Michael Jackson was in New York, and it was like, oh my God, this is so amazing. They were in different parts of the world, and you know, and it's like nowadays. I recorded James Blunt. I was in Capitol and he was in Abbey Road, and we did it by ISDN. And what happened is I was producing his vocal, and then, you know, and I got so used to working with him for an hour or two doing the vocal, and at the end of it, I was kind of wanting to walk out and give him a hug and say goodbye, and I'm like, wait there. Oh, you're actually in London and I'm in Los Angeles. It was crazy. And his engineer just uploaded the files. I mean, I had the ISDN kind of like, you know, flew halfway across the world kind of stuff, but then he uploaded the files, and I just lined it up for the comp, and God bless America. It was, yeah. I mean, that would have been, when we were kids, that would have been like, oh my God, how did they do that? You know, magic.
To be honest, it still, I mean, I have a science background, so I know how quite a lot of it works, but it still seems like magic to me.
Marvelous. Well, look, let's finish on magic. Magic's a good way to finish.
Absolutely.
Thank you ever so much. We're going to have the website link will be appearing probably at various times and annotated during the video, and hopefully just here and of course down below. So please everyone go and check it out. And thank you ever so much for being so gracious. I love your whole philosophy and attitude about creativity and about, you know, getting out there and doing it, because that's half the thing. Most of the time, I used to sit there paralyzed, not doing anything. And we really just need to be doing this and trying it out and, you know, getting creative and enjoying it, you know. So I appreciate all of your positive attitude and your helpfulness to everybody. You've been a great mentor to many, many people. So Thank you very much.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. It's really good to talk to you.
Marvellous. All right, thanks everybody. Have a marvellous time recording and mixing. Please leave a bunch of questions and comments below. If there's anything pertinent to Ian, I might throw him under the bus and make him answer it.
No, I'll be happy to.
Thanks. Bye-bye.